A Jedi Master ignited his lightsaber over a sleeping child. The child was his student, his nephew, someone he loved. And in the half-second before he stopped himself, before he pulled the blade back and chose differently, the damage was already done. The boy had seen it. And that single moment, that one reflexive reach toward darkness that lasted less than a heartbeat, would produce a monster. That is the thing no one tells you about the Jedi. The darkness that destroyed them did not come from outside. Not always. Not even mostly. It came from inside, from their own choices, their own blind spots, their own moments of reaching for something terrible. And sometimes not stopping in time. The Jedi Order existed for over 36,000 years. In that time, they survived wars that erased civilizations, betrayals that broke the galaxy in half, and enemies so powerful that entire planets fell silent in their wake. They survived all of it. And then, in the end, they were destroyed anyway. Not by a weapon they could not counter, by a pattern they could never quite see clearly enough to break. This is the story of that pattern. The moments they do not put in the ceremonial histories, the decisions that looked like wisdom until they did not, the falls that began not with rage or greed, but with grief, with love, with the specific, unbearable weight of wanting to protect someone and not knowing how. These are the darkest moments in Jedi history, and some of them will change the way you understand everything you thought you knew about the order that carried the light. Not every tragedy in Jedi history was caused by an outside enemy. Some of the deepest wounds the Order ever suffered came from within. And to understand that, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, before the Republic existed, before the Sith had a name, before lightsabers, before the Code, before any of the traditions that would define the Jedi for millennia had been written down or passed on. You have to go back to Tython. Tython was a planet in the deep core of the galaxy, and it was there, more than 36,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, that the first Force-sensitive beings gathered. They came from different worlds and different cultures, drawn together by the mysterious pyramid-shaped vessels known as the Tho-Yor ships. These ships seemed to seek them out, seemed to know them. Whatever force was guiding the Tho-Yor, it had a purpose. And that purpose was to bring these scattered individuals to the same place at the same time. What assembled on Tython was something remarkable. Philosophers and scholars, priests and warriors, people who had always known they were different, who had always felt something flowing through them that others could not perceive. They called that something the Force, and they built their civilization around understanding it. These early settlers called themselves the Jedi, spelled with an apostrophe and a particular emphasis that reflected the original, older language they drew from. And for thousands of years, their philosophy was unlike anything that would come after. The Jedi of this era did not see the light side and the dark side as good and evil. They saw them as two aspects of a single whole, two currents in the same river. The light side, which they named Ashla, represented peace and harmony and healing. The dark side, which they called Bogan, embodied passion and strength and transformation. Neither was superior, neither was the enemy. Together they were the Force, and the Force was everything. This balanced philosophy shaped every aspect of life on Tython. The Jedi built massive temple complexes across the planet, and each one specialized in different aspects of Force study. Students traveled between them, absorbing knowledge from different masters, different traditions, different perspectives. When a student leaned too deeply toward the light side and lost their passion, they were sent to meditate on one of Tython's moons. When a student leaned too deeply toward the dark side and lost their peace, they were sent to meditate on the other. The goal was always to return to the center, always to find balance. For thousands of years, this worked. The Jedi on Tython maintained their equilibrium and built something genuinely beautiful, a civilization rooted in the honest acknowledgement that existence contained both light and darkness, and that wisdom lay not in choosing one and destroying the other, but in learning to carry both. Then the cracks began. You cannot maintain perfect balance forever in a society made of individuals. People develop preferences. They develop convictions. They look at the world around them and decide, with complete sincerity, that they have found the truth. And sometimes those sincere convictions are incompatible with the sincere convictions of the person standing next to them. Within the Jedi community on Tython, a philosophical divide had been growing for generations before it finally erupted. Some practitioners became increasingly devoted to the light side of the Force. They looked at what Ashla offered and decided that passion and darkness were not balance points to be maintained, but dangers to be eliminated. Others moved in the opposite direction, drawn to the raw power and freedom that Bogan provided. They looked at the Order's careful restraint and saw limitation. They saw a philosophy that was afraid of its own potential. What had once been a spectrum of sincere belief slowly polarized into two opposing camps. And on Tython, where the Force itself was so deeply entwined with the planet's nature, that polarization did not stay philosophical for long. The tension erupted into open war. The Force Wars of Tython did not begin with a single dramatic confrontation. They began the way most terrible things begin, gradually, then all at once. The exact trigger point is lost to history. Perhaps it was a council vote that went the wrong way. Perhaps it was a betrayal between former friends. Perhaps it was simply the slow accumulation of resentment finally reaching its limit. Whatever started it, what followed was catastrophic. Jedi fought Jedi across the surface of Tython. Not training exercises, not philosophical debates, full warfare. Force powers unleashed against people who had grown up in the same temples, studied from the same teachers, meditated under the same moons. The skills they had spent lifetimes developing in the name of understanding the Force were now being used to destroy each other, and Tython itself responded. This was perhaps the most haunting aspect of the conflict. The planet was so deeply saturated with Force energy, so fundamentally connected to the balance between light and dark, that when that balance was violently shattered, the world reacted. Storms erupted across the surface. Earthquakes cracked the foundations of temples that had stood for centuries. The ecosystem that had once been described as beautiful and harmonious became unstable, dangerous, unpredictable. It was as though the planet was in pain. The Force Wars raged for years, heavy losses on both sides. Entire lineages of masters and students cut down in the fighting. Knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years burned when the temples fell. People who had dedicated their lives to understanding the nature of existence died, trying to impose their particular understanding of it on everyone else. Eventually, the light side adherents won. The followers of Bogan were defeated. Many were killed in the final battles. Others were forced to flee or publicly renounce their practices. The war was over, and the light had prevailed. But winning a war is not the same as solving the problem that caused it, and what the victorious Jedi chose to do next would reshape the course of galactic history in ways they could not have anticipated. The leaders of the light side faction made a decision that seemed, in the aftermath of so much violence, like clarity. They had seen what happened when people maintained too close a relationship with the dark side of the Force. They had watched their colleagues turn against them, unleash destruction, bring pain to everything they touched. The lesson seemed obvious. The balance they had tried to maintain was not working. The dark side was not a river current to be respected and managed. It was a threat to be rejected entirely, so they rejected it. The newly reorganized Jedi Order abandoned the balanced philosophy that had defined their civilization for millennia. They simplified even their name, dropping the apostrophe, shortening it, marking a clean break from the past. And they committed themselves fully and completely to the light side of the Force: peace, knowledge, serenity, harmony. These became the pillars of Jedi identity. Passion and darkness were not simply deprioritized, they were declared dangerous. They were coded into the emerging traditions as paths that led to destruction. The Jedi had seen what happened when someone followed Bogan too deeply. They never wanted to see it again. What they could not see, in that moment of understandable fear and grief, was what they were giving up. The ancient Jedi had understood something profound, that light and dark were not enemies, but partners. That true wisdom required holding both. That a philosophy which acknowledged only one half of existence was not balanced wisdom, but chosen blindness. In their attempt to protect themselves from the dark side, the reforming Jedi Order quietly discarded the deepest insight their ancestors had ever reached. It would take tens of thousands of years and uncountable tragedies before anyone truly understood what had been lost on Tython. But there was more immediate darkness coming. The defeated dark side practitioners did not simply disappear after their loss in the Force Wars. Those who survived were cast out of the Order, exiled from Tython, driven away from the community they had grown up in, their practices forbidden, their philosophy condemned. They scattered into the wider galaxy with their knowledge intact and their resentment burning. Some of those exiles eventually found each other. Some passed their teachings down, and the seeds of what would later become the Sith had been quietly, invisibly planted in the aftermath of a war that the light side believed it had won. The first great darkness had ended. The next one was already beginning to grow. Thousands of years passed. The Jedi Order, now committed fully to the light side, established itself across the galaxy. They built new temples on new worlds. They joined with the emerging Galactic Republic as its peacekeepers and guardians. They developed the philosophy, the traditions, the code that would define them for the rest of their long history. And by and large, they did good. They protected people. They resolved conflicts. They brought wisdom to places that had none. But inside the Order, the seeds of crisis were never truly gone. They were simply dormant, waiting for the right conditions. Those conditions arrived. A faction of Jedi had grown deeply frustrated with the direction of the Order, not troublemakers or moral failures, but serious practitioners who had looked long and hard at what the Jedi were teaching and concluded that something essential was being left out. They wanted more. They craved deeper knowledge. They believed the Order had drawn its philosophical boundaries too narrowly, had forbidden too much in the name of caution, had sacrificed genuine understanding for the comfort of simple rules. They were not entirely wrong in their criticism. The Jedi Order had, in its rejection of the dark side, placed enormous territories of Force knowledge off limits. Ancient practices, complex rituals, ways of engaging with the Force that earlier traditions had understood and worked with. All of it had been sealed away, declared dangerous, left unexplored. The Jedi, who were growing frustrated, had a point when they argued that this represented a failure of intellectual courage. But the methods they chose to address that frustration moved them far beyond intellectual courage and into something much darker. This faction began experimenting with Sith alchemy. Not gently, not carefully, not with the cautious, scholarly approach that might have been defensible. They threw themselves into it with ambition and hunger. They began using dark side techniques to alter and combine living things in ways that had no healing purpose, no peaceful application. They created monstrous creatures, living weapons, abominations that had never been meant to exist, shaped from flesh and darkness and will, sent out to serve as tools of destruction. The Jedi Council's response was swift and decisive. These practices were condemned. The practitioners were ordered to stop. When they refused, they were expelled from the Order entirely. And those who refused expulsion faced force. What followed was a century of catastrophic civil war. Historians would call it the 100-Year Darkness. That name is precise, in a way that still manages to undersell the horror of it. For 100 years, Jedi fought Jedi across the galaxy. Not on a single world, not in a contained theater of conflict, but across the Republic itself. World after world, drawn into the violence. Entire systems caught between opposing Force-sensitive armies and the terrible powers they wielded. Among the leaders of the Dark Jedi faction were figures whose names would be remembered in the darkest chapters of Sith history. Arjun Tapal, a warrior of enormous strength and unbounded ambition. Kez Moore, who had mastered forbidden techniques that the Jedi Council could barely comprehend. Sukan, whose knowledge of the dark side ran deeper than almost anyone alive. These were not weak or foolish individuals. They were genuinely powerful, genuinely dangerous, and genuinely convinced that they were doing what needed to be done. The Dark Jedi unleashed the full horror of their alchemical creations during this conflict. Monstrous beasts that served them in battle and terrorized civilian populations. Creatures that had been twisted from living things into tools of war. The Jedi defending the Republic had never faced anything quite like it. They had trained for threats they could understand and counter. Nothing in their preparation had accounted for weapons that breathed and bled. Despite the horror, despite the scale, despite the years and the losses, the Dark Jedi ultimately could not win. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Korbos. There, the Jedi Order brought the full weight of its remaining strength to bear and crushed the rebellion. The Dark Jedi were defeated, their armies broken, their monstrous creations destroyed or scattered. And then the Republic and the Jedi Order made a decision that would change galactic history forever. They chose mercy. Not execution, not imprisonment, mercy. The Dark Jedi were stripped of their weapons and their belongings. They were loaded onto unarmed ships, and they were sent away. Exiled from Republic space, pushed out into the unknown regions beyond the boundaries of everything the Republic knew. Told to go and not come back. It seemed, in the moment, like the compassionate choice. Like the choice that reflected Jedi values. The war was over. The enemy was defeated. Killing them all when they were already beaten would have been... The thinking went, something a Jedi should not do. What nobody understood in that moment was the magnitude of what that mercy had set in motion. The exiled Dark Jedi drifted through unknown space for weeks. Lost, humiliated, burning with resentment at an order that had cast them out for daring to ask questions it did not want answered. They had their Force abilities. They had their dark side knowledge. They had the alchemical techniques they had been condemned for developing. And they had absolutely nothing left to lose. Then they found Korriban. The world was home to a species called the Sith. Red-skinned humanoids with a natural affinity for the dark side of the Force, though they understood it only as something close to magic. They had their own traditions and their own power structures. But when the Dark Jedi arrived among them, what the Sith saw was something they had no framework to understand. They saw gods. The exiled Dark Jedi were Force users of tremendous skill arriving among a people who had never encountered anything like them. They used their powers to awe the native population, to demonstrate abilities that seemed miraculous and terrifying. The Sith worshipped them, and the Dark Jedi, who had just been stripped of everything and cast into exile, accepted that worship. They took control of the Sith civilization. They ruled it. They intermarried with the native species over generations, blending bloodlines and cultures and knowledge, until something new and unprecedented emerged. The strongest of the exiled Dark Jedi declared himself the first Dark Lord of the Sith. He established the Sith Order as its own tradition, distinct from the Jedi who had expelled him, built on different values, pursuing different goals. They were no longer Dark Jedi. They were Sith Lords, and they were going to make sure that those who had cast them out would one day understand the scale of the mistake they had made. The tragedy of the 100-year darkness is not just the war itself. Wars are terrible, but they end. The deeper tragedy is what the Jedi's mercy created. In trying to be compassionate, in choosing not to execute their defeated enemies, they sent those enemies to a distant corner of the galaxy where they had centuries and millennia to develop, to grow, to build an empire, and to cultivate a hatred of the Jedi Order that would eventually come back and cause suffering on a scale the original mercy givers could never have imagined. Every Sith atrocity in the thousands of years that followed, every Jedi killed by a red lightsaber, every world burned by a Dark Lord's ambition, every civilization shattered in the wars between light and dark, all of it traces a line back to the moment when the Jedi chose to exile rather than destroy. It was not a wrong choice by any simple moral measure, but the consequences of it were vast and terrible and lasted for thousands of years. The Jedi did not know what they had created. They believed the threat was over. They spent the following centuries rebuilding, focusing on their traditions and their growth, secure in the knowledge that the great Dark Jedi rebellion had been ended. They were wrong. In the hidden reaches of the galaxy, the Sith were building something, and they would not be hidden forever. The moment when the Sith Empire's existence was revealed to the Republic And the Jedi was not a dramatic military strike. It was an accident. A merchant vessel crewed by a pair of siblings, explorers looking for new trade routes, accidentally dropped out of hyperspace in Sith territory. They had no idea what they had found. They had no idea that the people who captured them were the descendants of the Dark Jedi. The Republic had exiled thousands of years ago. By the time they escaped and returned to Republic space, events had been set in motion that could not be stopped. The Sith Lord who orchestrated their escape had used their arrival as a pretext to claim the throne of the Sith Empire and launch an invasion of the Republic that the Jedi were completely unprepared for. There had been a warning. One Jedi, a scholar and seer, had seen what was coming in Force visions. He had raised the alarm. He had gone to the councils and the leaders and told them, with as much clarity as he could manage, that something dark was approaching, that the Force was showing him something terrible on the horizon. He was not taken seriously. This is one of the patterns that would repeat throughout Jedi history with devastating consequences. A single voice, sometimes many voices, warning of a threat that the leadership did not want to believe. The tendency to trust the stability of the current moment over the possibility of disruption. The Jedi were at peace. The galaxy was functioning. The warnings felt abstract, perhaps overstated, perhaps the product of an overly anxious mind. Then the Sith fleet arrived. The invasion struck multiple Republic worlds simultaneously. Coruscant itself came under attack. The Jedi, who had never faced Sith combatants before, who had no preparation for the particular techniques the Sith wielded, were initially overwhelmed. The dark side abilities the Sith employed were unlike anything in Jedi training. The sorcery used to multiply the apparent size of the Sith fleet created chaos and terror wherever it appeared. The Republic's defenders could not trust what they were seeing, could not be certain which threats were real and which were illusions, and that uncertainty cost lives. This was not a failure of courage on the Jedi's part. They fought. They died. They defended people who could not defend themselves. But there is a specific kind of darkness in being unprepared for a threat that was preventable, in having had the warning and set it aside, in watching people die because someone's vision of catastrophe was not given the weight it deserved. The warnings had been real. The threat had been real. The cost of disbelieving it was paid in blood across multiple worlds. The Republic ultimately won that war. The tide turned when the Sith Lord's concentration was broken, collapsing the illusions that had made his fleet appear unstoppable. Republic morale surged. The counterattack was massive. The Sith Empire, caught in the nightmare combination of a Republic counterattack and its own internal civil war, collapsed with extraordinary speed. What followed was the Jedi's attempt to make sure it could never happen again. Teams moved through Sith territory, seizing and destroying every piece of Sith knowledge they could find. Holocrons, texts, artifacts. Any record of dark side practices was either secured in heavily guarded vaults or simply destroyed. The intention was to eliminate the threat at the root. No knowledge meant no revival. No revival meant no second invasion. It was a reasonable attempt at security. It was also, in several critical ways, a failure. Some Sith survived. Some knowledge escaped. And the belief that the threat was now truly gone, that the victory was permanent, settled into the Jedi Order with a comfort that made them less alert, less vigilant, less prepared for what was already beginning to grow again in the shadows. The pattern would repeat. Victory, followed by relief, followed by the assumption that the war was finally over, and the darkness always finding a way to return. Not every disaster in Jedi history came from outside forces. Some came from inside the Order itself, from individual members who fell, whose falling created ripples that lasted centuries. One of the most haunting examples of this is a Jedi student whose name became synonymous with dark ambition and corrupted potential. His name was Freedon Nad. Nad was talented, genuinely talented, in the way that matters most for someone training in the Force. He had ability that his teachers recognized early. He had drive. He had the kind of potential that a Jedi Master looks at and thinks, "This one will go far." And by every measure of natural gift, that assessment was correct. The problem was what came with the talent. Nad wanted power, not in the careful, disciplined way the Jedi Order taught, not power in service of wisdom or compassion or the greater good. He wanted it in the raw, unqualified sense. He wanted to be one of the greatest Force users who ever lived. He wanted to go beyond what any of his teachers had achieved. And when the Jedi Order, with its careful structure and its graduated advancement and its emphasis on patience and humility, could not give him that quickly enough, the resentment built. He was denied promotion to the rank of Jedi Knight. The reasons behind this decision are debated in the historical record. But what is clear is that Nad experienced the denial not as guidance, but as injustice. He had the ability. He was working. Why was he being held back? The Council's caution, which was probably wisdom on their part, read to Nad as something else entirely. It read as the system protecting itself against someone who threatened to outgrow it. What he did next was not impulsive. It was deliberate. He struck down his master, not in a moment of passion, not as an accident, not as self-defense. He killed the person who had trained him and invested years of care and teaching in his development. He killed the person who knew him best. And then he left. He followed rumors and ancient texts and Force intuition out into the galaxy, searching for the power the Jedi Order had refused to give him. He found it on Yavin 4, in the tomb of a great Sith Lord who had survived the collapse of the Sith Empire through dark rituals preserved in suspended animation, through ceremonies that Nad pieced together from the surrounding dark side energies and his own Force sensitivity. He made contact with that ancient spirit. The Sith, still present in some form even after his physical death, recognized the ambition in the young man who had come looking for him. The spirit took Nad as a student. He taught him everything he knew: Sith alchemy, dark side techniques that predated anything in Jedi records, the deep, seductive knowledge of the dark side that the Jedi had spent generations trying to seal away and destroy. Nad absorbed all of it. And then, when he had learned everything the Spirit could teach him, he betrayed it. He used everything he had been given to destroy the source of it. This was quintessentially Sith. The apprentice does not serve the master forever. The apprentice learns, grows, and eventually surpasses. Nad had fulfilled the dark side tradition perfectly. He traveled then to a world called Onderon, a planet at permanent war with itself, divided between a walled city and the wild lands outside it. Those inside the walls had one way of life. Those who had been exiled outside, who had learned to ride the massive flying beasts native to the planet, had another. Nad arrived and used his Sith powers to seize control, to declare himself king, to impose his will on a people who had no defense against someone with his abilities. He ruled Onderon for over a century. He died there eventually, as all living things do. But his death was not the end of his influence. His dark side spirit remained. It persisted. It guided his descendants. It shaped the culture of Onderon for generations after he was gone, creating a Sith tradition in the middle of Republic space that would take many more lives and many more Jedi missions to finally address. The tragedy of Freedon Nad is not simply that a Jedi fell. Falls happen. The deeper tragedy is the chain of consequences that follow from a single person's resentment and ambition. Every person who suffered under Onderon's dark rulers. Every Jedi who died on missions connected to that legacy. Every student who was later seduced by the artifacts and knowledge Nad left behind. All of that traces back to one talented young man who could not wait and could not accept limitation. The Jedi lost something the day Nad killed his master. They did not yet know how much they had lost. The darkness radiating from Onderon did not stay contained to that world. It spread, it influenced, it reached out across the decades and touched people who would never have chosen it if they had understood what they were reaching for. And among those it eventually touched was a pair of young aristocrats who stumbled into Sith territory, the way certain kinds of people stumble into things they do not understand, boldly and without caution. They were members of a secret society called the Krath, ambitious and curious and utterly without the training to safely engage with what they were pursuing. They found a Sith spellbook and began trying to decode it. Their attempts attracted attention. They began developing a following. They began developing power that they had not earned and did not understand. They moved into positions of military and political authority and began using dark side techniques on civilians and soldiers alike. This was not a small problem on a distant world. This was a threat spreading through the heart of the Republic, and the Jedi needed to respond. But this story is not really about the Krath. It is about the Jedi who tried to stop them and was broken in the attempt. His name was Ulic Qel-Droma, and at the time he entered this story, he was exactly the kind of Jedi that made the Order proud. Skilled, principled, brave. He had trained under one of the most respected masters of his era and absorbed everything that training had to offer. He believed in what the Order stood for with a genuine, unironic commitment that was not naive but earned. He was, in every sense, one of the good ones. The plan that Ulic brought to the Jedi Council was straightforward in conception, if dangerous in execution. The Krath needed to be infiltrated. Someone needed to go in, gain their trust, learn their plans, and feed information back to the Jedi. Ulic volunteered to be that person. He believed he was strong enough. He believed his commitment to the light side was deep enough to protect him from whatever darkness he might encounter inside the cult. The council was skeptical. There was a specific, pointed concern raised during the discussions. Going into the darkness and staying there, even with the best intentions, even with the clearest moral compass, is not a thing you can simply choose to do and remain unchanged. The Force does not work that way. The dark side does not work that way. You do not spend months or years surrounded by Sith teachings and Sith practitioners and come out exactly as you went in. It changes you. It works on you slowly. It finds the places where your resolve is thinner than you realized, and it presses on them. Gently at first, then harder. Then with everything it has. Ulick was warned. He understood the warning. He went anyway. The mission began as designed. He made contact with the Krath. He built relationships. He learned things about their plans and practices that were genuinely useful intelligence. But something else was happening beneath the surface that the Jedi watching from a distance could not see. Something that Ulick himself may not have fully recognized until it was too late. The leader of the Krath had significant natural ability in the dark side and a gift for emotional manipulation. And Ulick, despite everything he believed about himself, was not immune to that. The connection between them was real and complicated in ways that his Jedi training had not prepared him for. The darkness in the Krath was not something he could stand apart from and observe. It was something he was living inside. The moment that the Council had warned him about came. A moment when the darkness offered him something that felt, in the moment, like justice, like the ability to set right, something that had been done wrong. The Krath had hurt people Ulick cared about. The darkness in that environment offered him a way to respond to that hurt that felt like strength and looked like resolve, but was something else entirely. He fell. Not all at once. Falls rarely happen all at once, but the direction was set. And once the direction was set, those around him recognized it and pressed every advantage they had. But Ulick's fall was only the beginning of the greater disaster. Because someone else was already moving through the galaxy toward the same darkness from a completely different direction. His name was Exar Kun, and his story is perhaps the darkest individual Jedi fall in the entire history of the Order. Kun had been a Jedi student of genuine excellence. Brilliant, determined, technically gifted in ways that impressed his teachers, while also making them slightly uneasy. He had the ability to absorb force techniques with a speed that seemed almost unnatural. He had a confidence that bordered on arrogance and sometimes crossed that border entirely. But arrogance alone does not make a Dark Lord. Arrogance combined with a specific kind of intellectual ambition, the conviction that the rules constraining you are arbitrary and the forbidden things are only forbidden because other people are afraid of them, that combination is far more dangerous. Kun became fascinated with the dark side, not as an end in itself, but as a subject of study. He told himself that he was approaching it the way a scholar approaches a difficult text. Critically, analytically, not to be consumed by it, but to understand it. He believed that his intelligence was sufficient protection, that he could look into the darkness and come away with knowledge without being changed by what he saw. He began seeking out Sith artifacts, Sith holocrons, records of ancient dark side knowledge that the Jedi Order had long since locked away or destroyed. And he found more of it than he expected, because the Jedi's attempts to eliminate Sith knowledge had been thorough, but not complete. Pieces survived, traces remained, breadcrumbs that led, if you followed them carefully enough, to larger caches of forbidden information. His trail eventually took him to Onderon, to the dark energies that Freedon Nad had left behind. In that charged place, surrounded by force energies that had been saturated with Sith power for generations, Kun encountered the spirit of the long-dead Dark Lord. Nad recognized in Kun what had once been recognized in Nad himself. Someone who wanted more than they were being given. Someone who believed they deserved it. Nad's spirit offered Kun guidance, access to deeper knowledge, the opportunity to understand the Force at a level the Jedi Order had never allowed. And Kun, who had convinced himself that he was only here to understand, and not to be converted, accepted the guidance. He was already falling. He just had not admitted it yet. From Onderon, Kun followed the trail further. To Yavin 4, where the ancient Massassi temples stood in the jungle darkness, soaked in thousands of years of Sith power. There, Nad's spirit pressed him toward a ritual that would complete what had been started, a process of transformation that would give Kun access to the full depth of Sith knowledge, but would require him to make a choice he could no longer pretend was just academic curiosity. Kun made the choice. He embraced the dark side completely. The pretense of scholarly detachment fell away, and what emerged was something the galaxy had not seen in a long time. A fully realized Sith Lord with the skills of a trained Jedi, and none of the moral restraints the Order had spent years building into him. Nad's spirit believed it had created an apprentice. Kun destroyed it the moment he had taken everything it had to give. He was already learning the most fundamental lesson of the Sith tradition. What followed was devastation on a scale that had not been seen since the ancient wars. Exar Kun forged an alliance with the fallen Ulic Chel Droma, and together they became something that the Jedi Order was genuinely not prepared for. Two former Jedi, one corrupted by an infiltration mission gone catastrophically wrong, and one who had chosen the dark side with clear eyes, working in concert toward goals that neither the Republic nor the Jedi had the intelligence to fully anticipate. Kun performed a dark side ritual that corrupted dozens of young Jedi students in a single act, not through persuasion or gradual influence, but through direct dark side manipulation that reached into them and twisted something. Apprentices who had been on the path to becoming knights suddenly turned against their masters. The Order's youngest members became weapons against it. Masters who had devoted their lives to training these students watched those students attack them and had to choose between defending themselves and holding onto the belief that the people they were fighting were still the people they had known. Some of those masters did not survive the choice. Kun attacked the great Jedi library on Ossus, one of the greatest repositories of knowledge the Order had ever assembled. Millennia of accumulated wisdom, texts that could not be replaced, records of Force techniques, histories, philosophical works, the collected intellectual heritage of the Jedi at their best. Kun did not want the Jedi to have what the library contained, and so he moved against it with a ruthlessness that left no room for hesitation. This was the thing that distinguished Kun from merely dangerous opponents. He was not only attacking the Jedi's bodies, he was attacking their memory, their continuity, their ability to understand their own history and draw on the wisdom of their predecessors. A people who cannot access their past are vulnerable in ways that go beyond what any single battle can create. The war spread across multiple fronts and caused devastation across Republic space. But the moment that perhaps best captures the scale of the darkness Kun brought was not a military confrontation. It was what he did on Yavin 4. As Republic forces closed in and his defeat became inevitable, Kun made a final choice that defied comprehension. Rather than surrender, rather than flee, rather than accept the consequences of everything he had done, he performed a ritual that consumed the life force of every Massassi person living on Yavin 4. An entire culture, men and women and children, who had existed in those temples for generations, who had their own traditions and their own understanding of the world. Kun drained every one of them to fuel the preservation of his own essence. His physical body was destroyed, but his spirit survived, trapped in the temples, preserved by the lives he had stolen, waiting in the darkness for an age. The Jedi eventually brought this war to a close. Ulic Qel-Droma, his fall at last recognized fully even by himself, helped them find and bring Kuhn's physical power to an end. But the costs were incalculable. An entire generation of Jedi, dead or fallen. The library at Ossus catastrophically damaged. Entire systems of the Republic bearing wounds that would take decades to heal. And an entire people, the Massassi of Yavin 4, simply gone, consumed, used as fuel for one man's refusal to accept defeat. This was one of the darkest moments the Jedi ever lived through. Not because the enemy was powerful, though Kuhn was powerful. Not because the battle was close, though it was, but because of where Kuhn had come from. He had been one of them. The Order had trained him and invested in him, and believed in his potential. And what he had done with everything the Jedi gave him was use it to destroy an entire people and bring devastation to the galaxy. The question that hung over the Order in the aftermath was not one they could answer easily. What had gone wrong? Was it Kuhn's character? His training? The Order's approach to students who pushed boundaries? Were there things the Jedi could have done differently that might have caught what was happening before it went too far? These questions did not have clean answers. They probably never would. But they could not be set aside. Because the cost of not asking them was more Exar Kun's. The Jedi buried their dead. They rebuilt what they could. They tried to understand what they could and to live with what they could not understand. And they looked forward, hoping that the worst was behind them. It was not. A few centuries later, the galaxy found itself in a different kind of crisis. A warrior culture called the Mandalorians, one of the most formidable military forces in the known galaxy, had begun a sweeping campaign of conquest. World after world fell to them. Systems that had lived in peace for generations were brought under Mandalorian control through organized, disciplined military force that the Republic's defenders struggled to counter effectively. The Jedi watched. That sentence requires sitting with for a moment, because it is not a simple one. The Mandalorians were killing people. They were conquering worlds and imposing their rule by violence and destabilizing an entire region of Republic space. And the Jedi, who existed to protect peace and justice, who carried lightsabers specifically because there are situations that require someone willing to use force in defense of those who cannot defend themselves, were watching. The Jedi Council's position was not heartless in the way that it might first appear. They had genuine reasons for caution. The Force showed them things about the Mandalorian conflict that concerned them on levels beyond the immediate military situation. There was something happening in the background of this war that they could not fully see, but felt through the Force as a kind of shadow, a hidden element, a manipulation they could not yet identify. The Council believed, with what seemed like reasonable caution, that this felt like a trap, that charging into the conflict without understanding its full dimensions was the wrong move. They were not entirely wrong about the trap. There was a hidden dimension to the Mandalorian Wars. The ancient Sith Emperor had engineered the conflict specifically to draw the Jedi into a situation that would compromise them. The Council's instinct that something darker was at work behind the surface of the war was accurate, but their response to that accurate instinct caused its own catastrophe. Because while the Council deliberated and maintained its position of non-intervention, the people on the worlds the Mandalorians were conquering did not have the luxury of waiting for the full picture to become clear. They were living through it. They were dying in it. Entire communities were losing everything, while the order that carried lightsabers and called itself the guardian of peace and justice stood apart and watched and said, "The time is not right." For two Jedi, that position became impossible to maintain. Their names were Revan and Malak. They were two of the most gifted Jedi of their generation. Revan in particular was regarded as something close to exceptional, someone whose strategic mind and force sensitivity placed him in a category apart from most of his contemporaries. They had trained, they had grown, they had become the kind of Jedi that the Order pointed to as examples of what the training was supposed to produce. And they looked at the Mandalorian Wars and looked at the Council's response and decided that they could not stand aside any longer. They defied the Council. Openly, publicly, not sneaking away in the night, not pretending they had a mission that covered their real destination, but telling the Order directly that they were going to do what needed to be done and going. And they were not alone. Other Jedi felt the same way they did. Other knights and Padawans who could not reconcile the code they had sworn to uphold with the image of burning worlds and broken communities and the Council saying we must wait. They followed Revan and Malak into the war. In the moment, it looked like courage. Like exactly the kind of decisive Jedi action the Order was supposed to embody. Here were Jedi who refused to look away, who were willing to sacrifice the safety of staying out of it because they believed that safety was purchased at too high a price. But the Council's warning about the trap had not been wrong. And the Jedi who charged into the Mandalorian Wars were not just fighting Mandalorians. They were being guided, without knowing it, towards something far darker. Every battle they won drew them closer to the hidden hand behind the war. Every step they took into the Outer Rim moved them toward the influence of the ancient Sith Emperor who had wanted them there all along. Revan and Malak fought the Mandalorian Wars brilliantly. They won. Eventually, and at great cost, they won. The Mandalorian forces were broken at the Battle of Malachor V in a confrontation so devastating that the planet itself was destroyed by the mass shadow generator Revan had developed as a final weapon. Thousands died in that battle. Mandalorians and Republic soldiers and Jedi alike. The planet cracked apart. The galaxy held its breath. The Mandalorian Wars were over. But Revan and Malak did not come home. Instead, they pushed on into the unknown regions, following a trail that the war had revealed to them, following something that felt, through the Force, like the source of the darkness behind everything that had happened. They told those who asked that they were hunting the true enemy, that the Mandalorians had not been the real threat, and they needed to find what was. They were not entirely wrong. The Sith Emperor existed. He was real, and he was exactly as dangerous as they feared, but they were not ready for what they found. When Revan and Malak walked into the Sith Emperor's throne room, they believed they were the hunters. They had come to confront the hidden enemy and expose the truth behind the Mandalorian Wars. They were two of the most powerful Jedi alive, walking into that confrontation together with their skills and their bond and their certainty that they were doing what needed to be done. They walked out as the Emperor's servants. What the Sith Emperor did to them in that throne room is one of the most profoundly disturbing moments in Jedi history. He did not defeat them in a duel. He did not overwhelm them with superior force power in any conventional sense. He reached into their minds and reshaped what was inside them. He bent their will to his. He turned the two greatest Jedi of their generation into instruments of his purpose. Revan and Malak, who had gone looking for the enemy, became the enemy. They returned to Republic space not as heroes, but as Dark Lords of the Sith. They brought an army. They brought a war. And the Republic, still recovering from the Mandalorian conflict, found itself fighting the Jedi Civil War against an enemy it had once called its greatest defenders. The Jedi Civil War was not like previous conflicts. Previous wars had been between the Order and external enemies. Sith Lords who had grown up in the Sith tradition, who had chosen the dark side in ways the Jedi could trace and categorize. This was different. This was Jedi fighting Jedi. This was the skills and training and philosophical depth of the Order turned directly against itself. Revan and Malak understood Jedi tactics because they had been Jedi. They knew how Jedi thought. They knew where the weaknesses were. They knew what approaches would be most effective because they had learned those things inside the very walls of the Order itself. The Republic lost systems, lost territory, lost people, lost morale. The sight of former defenders now leading the enemy army was a psychological wound on top of a military one. Every victory Revan and Malak achieved was a reminder of what the Council's hesitation had cost. Every world they took was evidence that the Jedi who had tried to do the right thing by entering the Mandalorian Wars had been corrupted by the very darkness the Council had warned them about. And Jedi were dying, not just in battle but in their convictions. Because when you watch the two most gifted members of your generation turn fully to the dark side, when you see people who were trained in the same traditions you were trained in and believed the same things you believed now serving the enemy, it forces a question. If they could fall, who else could? If the Force could not protect them, what exactly were you trusting in? The Order was shaken in ways that went beyond military casualties. It was shaken in its deepest sense of itself. The Jedi Council, faced with a war they were losing and a Dark Lord they could not defeat directly, made a desperate choice. They identified Darth Revan as the key. End Revan, and the war might end with him. A strike team was assembled. Among its members was a Jedi named Bastila Shan. Young and powerful, and gifted with a rare ability called battle meditation, the capacity to influence the morale and fighting effectiveness of forces across an entire battlefield. The strike team found Revan's flagship. They boarded it. They fought their way toward Revan himself in what was intended as an assassination mission. But Malak, watching from a distance aboard his own ship, saw an opportunity. His master was vulnerable. His master was occupied with an enemy and could not respond to an attack from an unexpected quarter. Malak opened fire on Revan's own ship. He turned his weapons on his closest friend, on the person he had fought beside through the entire Mandalorian War and the years that followed. The person who had believed in him, trained beside him, stood with him when everyone else thought they were wrong. Malak fired on Revan's ship and tried to kill him. He failed. Revan survived, barely, and was captured by Bastila. But the intent was there. The act was real. And it tells you everything you need to know about what the dark side had done to two people who had, not that many years before, stood side by side and refused to let the galaxy burn while the Council deliberated. The Jedi Civil War continued without Revan at its head. Malak proved to be a crueler and less strategically sophisticated Dark Lord than his predecessor. He destroyed worlds that Revan had spared. He killed in ways that served no military purpose. The war grew darker under Malak's leadership in a way that even some who had followed Revan into battle found difficult to accept. The Jedi Council made another difficult choice. They had Revan in their custody, alive but broken, his memory destroyed by the trauma of Malak's betrayal and the subsequent capture. What they chose to do with him was not something they advertised openly. They rebuilt his identity, not through healing in any compassionate sense, but through deliberate reconstruction. They gave him a new name, a new history, a new face in the minds of his companions. They turned the Dark Lord of the Sith into a Republic soldier who did not know who he had been. They used him. They pointed him at the war like a weapon they had reprogrammed, hoping that the skills and the Force connection were still there, even if the person who had wielded them was effectively gone. And it worked, in the narrow sense that it produced the results they needed. Revan found the Star Forge. Revan confronted Malak. The war ended. But the cost of what the Council had done lingered long after the fighting stopped. The cost of deciding that one person's identity, one person's right to know who they were, mattered less than the urgency of the military situation. The Council had done something that in any other context they would have condemned without hesitation. They had done it because they believed the alternative was worse. And perhaps they were right, that the war needed to end. But rightness in outcome does not erase the weight of the means. It never does. The Jedi Civil War ended, but the order that emerged from it was diminished. Numbers reduced. Morale fractured. Trust in the Council's judgment complicated by the knowledge of what had been decided and done in the war's darkest moments. The wounds would not finish healing before the next darkness arrived. It arrived in the form of 3 individuals who moved through the ruins of the post-war galaxy like shadows, each one representing a different kind of threat that the Jedi had no established framework to address. The remnants of Revan and Malak's Sith forces did not simply dissolve when Malak was defeated. The war machines, the armies, the infrastructure of conquest, these things do not simply go away because the leader at the top is gone. They shatter into pieces, and some of those pieces are extremely dangerous. 3 Sith Lords had survived the fall of the Sith Empire and were moving through the galaxy with their own purposes. The first was Darth Nihilus, whose connection to the dark side had become something beyond ordinary Force sensitivity, something that had consumed his humanity and left behind an entity defined entirely by hunger. He was a wound in the Force wearing the shape of a man. He fed on Force-sensitive beings, draining their life and their connection to the Force with a power that had no precedent in Jedi records. The places where he moved became dead, silent, emptied of everything that the Force had touched. Entire ecosystems of Force sensitivity extinguished wherever he went. The second was Darth Sion, the Lord of Pain, who had died and refused to stay dead, who held himself together through sheer force of will and dark side power, his body a broken ruin of scars and failed flesh that kept moving because his hatred and his pain were strong enough to sustain it. He could not be killed by any conventional means. Every injury he sustained simply became part of the structure of suffering that he maintained himself with. He was a nightmare in the shape of a person, and he moved through the galaxy hunting Jedi with a patience born of the certainty that no one could stop him. The third was Darth Traya, the Lord of Betrayal, whose relationship with the Force was more complicated and more dangerous than either of her companions. Traya had once been a Jedi Master. She had taught, she had guided students, she had believed in the Order and in the Force itself. And she had watched the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War and the Council's choices throughout both of them. And she had come to a conclusion that she held with absolute certainty. The Force was not a guide to be trusted. It was a wound in the galaxy that kept producing suffering, kept creating cycles of violence, kept manufacturing both Jedi and Sith as instruments of an endless war that served no one's actual interests. And the Jedi Order, which called itself the Guardian of Peace, but kept standing at the center of catastrophe after catastrophe, deserved to end. These three were known as the Sith Triumvirate, and together they nearly accomplished something that all of the previous wars and Dark Lords and crises had failed to do. They nearly wiped out the Jedi Order entirely. Their campaign against the Jedi was not a frontal military assault. It was a careful, targeted elimination. One by one, Jedi Masters were found and killed. The locations of the surviving members of the Order, scattered after the Civil War, were tracked down through Sith intelligence and through the Force itself. The Triumvirate moved through the galaxy's remaining Jedi like a blade through silence. No grand battles, no dramatic confrontations, in most cases. Just disappearances, deaths. Masters who had survived everything else, simply not returning from wherever they had gone. The galaxy did not fully understand what was happening until it was nearly complete. By the time the extent of the purge became clear, the Jedi Order had been reduced to almost nothing. The Council had been killed on Katar, an entire colony of Force-sensitive beings drained of life by Nihilus in a single act that left the planet a graveyard. The surviving Masters were isolated, scattered, cut off from each other, hunted. The traditions and the structures and the sense of continuity that had defined the Order for thousands of years were dangerously close to simply ceasing to exist. What saved the Jedi was a single individual, not a great master or a powerful warrior in the conventional sense. A former Jedi who had severed her own connection to the Force during the Battle of Malachor V, who had spent years as an exile walking through the galaxy with no Force sensitivity at all, who had somehow survived what the Triumvirate had done to everyone else around her. She is remembered as the exile, and her role in what followed is its own remarkable story. But the fact of the situation, the bare fact of how close the Order came to simply being finished, is worth sitting with on its own. The Jedi had survived the Force Wars and the 100-Year Darkness and the Great Hyperspace War and the Great Sith War and the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War. They had endured all of that, and the Sith Triumvirate had still nearly ended them. The Order survived, barely, and with wounds that took generations to heal. But the experience had changed the institution in ways that were not always visible from the outside. The Jedi that emerged from those events were more careful, more aware of what it meant to train someone in the Force in a galaxy that had shown, repeatedly and catastrophically, what happened when that training went wrong. They rebuilt. They trained new generations. They re-established their presence in the Republic as peacekeepers and guardians. And the centuries that followed were, comparatively, quieter. The Sith had been reduced to operating in shadow, to the tradition established by Darth Bane, who had deliberately destroyed the Brotherhood of Darkness, a large order of Sith practitioners who had warred against themselves into collective weakness. Bane had understood that the Sith's greatest enemy was their own internal competition, that the dark side needed to be concentrated, not spread across dozens of mediocre practitioners who spent more energy fighting each other than the Jedi. Two Sith, always and only two, a master to embody power and an apprentice to crave it. This new Sith tradition operated in shadow, hidden from the Jedi, patient in ways the old Sith had never been capable of sustaining for long. Working not through armies and invasions, but through politics and manipulation and the careful positioning of pieces across a chessboard, the Jedi could not fully see. And the Jedi, believing as they often had that the threat was diminished, that the current calm would hold, settled into a pattern that had claimed them before. It is not a thing to judge them too harshly for. Any institution that has weathered crisis after crisis develops, inevitably, a tendency to trust the present peace, to attend to the immediate and the visible, and to be less vigilant about the possibilities that have not yet revealed themselves. The 1,000 years of peace under the rule of two Sith produced a Jedi Order that was, in many ways, at its most stable and most accomplished. They numbered in the thousands. They had beautiful temples. They trained their members with care and graduated them through a system that had been refined over centuries. They served the Republic faithfully and were genuinely respected and genuinely effective. But they had also become, in subtle ways that no single Jedi could easily articulate, slightly rigid, slightly removed from the emotional lives of the people they served. The prohibitions against attachment that had always been part of Jedi teaching had, over those long centuries of stability, calcified into something that sometimes felt less like wisdom and more like an institutional defense against the complexity of human feeling. The Council had become excellent at deliberation and cautious about action in ways that were sometimes wise and sometimes not. And somewhere in the shadows of the galaxy, the last two Sith were watching, learning, shaping their plan with the patience of people who had been given 1,000 years to get it exactly right. The darkness was forming again. The difference this time was that when it arrived, it would not come as an army from the Outer Rim or a rebellion within the Order's own ranks. It would come from inside the Republic itself, from the most trusted chambers of power, from within the life of a young boy whose connection to the Force was unlike anything the Order had ever measured. That story, and the terrible choices that surrounded it, belongs to the second half of what has been started tonight. For now, let these first chapters rest. The Force Wars of ancient Tython, the 100-year darkness, and the mercy that built the Sith Empire, the ignored warnings before the Great Hyperspace War and the lives that cost, the fall of Freedon Nad and the centuries of dark legacy his murder created, the corruption of Ulic Eldroma and the destruction Exar Kun brought upon the Massassi, the Mandalorian Wars and the Council's impossible choices, the fall of Revan and Malak, the civil war fought Jedi against Jedi, and the near annihilation brought by the Sith triumvirate. These are the first half of the darkest story the galaxy ever told about the Jedi. Find your stillness now. Let the weight of these ancient things settle gently wherever you are. The night is quiet. The stories have been told, and there will be time when the light returns to hear the rest. The Jedi Order that existed in its final centuries was not a broken institution. That is important to understand before the rest of this story can be told honestly. The Order that faced its last great crisis was one that had rebuilt from near extinction multiple times. It had absorbed the lessons of the Sith triumvirate and the Jedi Civil War and all the centuries of darkness before them, and continued functioning. It trained its members carefully. It served the Republic with genuine dedication. It produced remarkable individuals, masters of the Force and philosophy and diplomacy and combat, who spent their lives in the service of people they would never meet. It was also in ways that were not always easy to see from the inside, an institution that had grown old in certain specific ways. Not corrupt, not evil, just old, in the way that very old institutions sometimes become, slightly more certain of its own rightness than the evidence entirely supported, slightly more comfortable with its traditions than with the questions those traditions could not answer, and slightly less connected to the raw, complicated, unpredictable emotional reality of the people it served. The High Republic era, the centuries when the Jedi were at perhaps their most broadly active and respected, when they built outposts across the Outer Rim and engaged with the galaxy in ambitious and visible ways, was also a period when the internal culture of the Order was becoming more refined in ways that were not entirely healthy. The rules around attachment had always been part of Jedi teaching, rooted in genuine wisdom about what unchecked emotional investment could do to a Force user. But over the centuries, those rules had become, for many members of the Order, less a living philosophy and more a set of behavioral regulations. Things you did not do because you were a Jedi. Things you did not feel, or at least did not acknowledge feeling, because feeling them would complicate your identity as a Jedi. This is a subtle thing, a quiet thing. Not the kind of darkness that announces itself with lightning and red lightsabers. The kind that grows slowly in the space between what an institution officially believes and what its members actually experience. The Jedi of the High Republic era were largely good people trying to do good work. But they were doing that work within a structure that had started, in small ways, to prioritize the form of Jedi virtue over its substance. And somewhere in the shadows of that galaxy, two Sith were watching. Always two. Always patient. Always planning. The Sith Master, who would eventually be known as Darth Sidious, had been working his plan for decades before anything visible began to unfold. He had studied the Jedi Order with the attention of someone who understood that it was not enough to be more powerful than your enemy. You had to understand them, their structure, their blind spots, the specific ways in which their greatest strengths could be turned against them. What he understood about the Jedi was something that their own leadership had not fully articulated to themselves. The Order was not going to be destroyed by a frontal assault. That had been tried by Sith Lords more powerful in some respects than Sidious himself. And it had failed every time. The Jedi were too resilient, too adaptive, too capable of rising to meet an enemy they could see and name and fight directly. The only way to truly end them was to remove that capacity for response, to create conditions in which the crisis arrived before the Jedi understood what it was, to make them complicit in their own destruction without ever knowing they were being used. This required patience on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Decades of careful positioning, decades of building relationships and cultivating influence and placing pieces on a board so large that no single Jedi could see its full dimensions. And it required, at the center of the plan, a child, a specific child, found on a desert world at the edge of everything, in circumstances so unusual that they attracted the attention of a Jedi Master who had spent his entire career trusting his instincts over the Council's caution. Qui-Gon Jinn was not a typical member of the Jedi Order by the time he encountered Anakin Skywalker. He had the skills and the dedication, but he had also, over the course of his long career, developed a relationship with the will of the Force that was more direct and less mediated by Council approval than most of his colleagues were comfortable with. He listened to the living force. He followed where it led, even when where it led was inconvenient or unorthodox. And it led him to a small boy on Tatooine with a force sensitivity reading higher than anything in recorded Jedi history. Qui-Gon believed immediately and completely that this child was the prophesied chosen one, the being who would bring balance to the Force. He believed it with the certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime learning to hear what the Force is saying through the texture of lived experience. He brought Anakin before the Jedi Council with a request to train him. The Council refused. The reasons they gave were not unreasonable on their face. Anakin was too old. The standard practice was to begin training in early childhood, before attachments had formed and before emotional patterns had calcified into habits difficult to reshape. Anakin was 9 years old, which by Jedi standards meant he had already spent years forming connections and experiences and ways of responding to the world that Jedi training was intended to happen before. He had a mother he loved. He had a life, however difficult, that he had inhabited long enough to become himself within it. The Council's concern about his fear, about the depth of emotional life visible in him, was also not unreasonable. Fear is the beginning of the path to the dark side, and the Force vision Yoda reported from Anakin's presence was one of darkness, clouded and uncertain, edged with something that gave even the ancient Jedi Master pause. But here is the thing that must be said honestly about the Council's decision. They were not wrong about the risks. They were not wrong about what they sensed. And they were also, in that moment, seeing a child through the lens of an institutional framework that was not designed to know what to do with someone like him. Everything about Anakin fell outside the established categories. His midi-chlorian count, his background, his age, his emotional intensity, his origins, which Qui-Gon believed were miraculous in a way that should itself have given the Council pause, not as a reason to refuse him, but as a reason to think very carefully about what refusing him would mean. Qui-Gon was killed before he could train Anakin himself. He was killed by a Sith, the first Sith openly encountered by the Jedi in 1,000 years. And his death was itself a message that the old war had never actually ended, that the rule of two had been operating in secret throughout the entire period. The Order believed it was living in peace. He died in front of his Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi, on Naboo, in a fight that ended the way it did because the Sith was faster and more ruthless. And Qui-Gon was alone when he should not have been. And with Qui-Gon dead and Obi-Wan grieving, the Council made a different choice than they had made while Qui-Gon was alive to advocate. They agreed to allow Anakin to be trained, not because their concerns had been addressed, but because the situation had changed. Because Obi-Wan had pledged to train the boy as his master's dying wish. Because the Sith had reappeared after 1,000 years of absence, and everything had suddenly become more complicated and more urgent. It was not the worst decision the Council ever made, but it was made for reasons that had more to do with the circumstances of Qui-Gon's death than with any genuine resolution of the questions his request had raised. Anakin was taken into the Order not with a full, clear-eyed plan for how to address what made him unusual, but with a decision to proceed and hope that the training would be enough. The training was not enough. There is a larger context in which Anakin's individual training was embedded, and that context matters for understanding what the Order was becoming even before the Purge. The Clone Wars themselves represented something that the Jedi had never been before and should, perhaps, have resisted becoming. They were generals, military commanders leading armies of engineered soldiers into large-scale industrial warfare, making tactical decisions about how to deploy clones in operations that could cost hundreds of lives in an afternoon. This was not what the Jedi were for. It was not what their training had prepared them for, at least not at the scale the wars demanded. And the longer the Clone Wars continued, the more the Order's institutional identity shifted toward this military function and away from the peacekeeping role that had defined them for most of their history. Jedi who might have spent careers mediating disputes and protecting individuals from violence were now planning assault strategies and managing battlefield logistics. The contemplative, philosophical life that Jedi tradition was built around had very little space to breathe inside the rhythms of an active war. Some Jedi adapted. Some excelled as military commanders in ways that were genuinely impressive by any tactical standard. But adaptation and excellence are not the same as being where you should be. The Clone Wars placed the Jedi in a position that was difficult in ways they did not fully articulate to themselves, because acknowledging the difficulty would have required stepping back from a war that genuinely needed to be fought. And stepping back was not an option. And while the Jedi were fighting a war they had been maneuvered into, the Sith Master who had arranged the maneuvering sat at the center of the Republic. They were fighting to protect and cultivated his influence, and waited for the moment when the pieces had moved far enough into position. Not because Obi-Wan was a poor teacher. He was an excellent teacher. Not because Anakin was ungrateful or undedicated. He worked harder than almost anyone around him and developed into a Force user of extraordinary ability. But the specific thing that Anakin needed, the thing that the Order's structure was not designed to provide, was a way to hold what he felt without being consumed by it. He needed a path through his own emotional life that was not simply suppression. He needed a teacher who could sit with him in the darkness of what he experienced, the grief and the fear and the love and the rage, and help him integrate it rather than exile it. What he got instead was very good teaching in the Jedi tradition as it existed, which meant being told, in various ways, that what he felt was something to manage, to release, to let go of, rather than something to understand. The distinction sounds subtle. The consequence was not. He loved Padme Amidala. He had met her as a child, and the connection formed between them had never released him. They married in secret, which was a violation of the Jedi Code, and the secrecy itself became a wound. Not because the love was wrong, but because the hiding of it placed everything about his most important relationship into a framework of shame and concealment that he had to maintain constantly around the people who were supposed to know him best. And then the visions came. The Force had always spoken to Anakin in images and feelings, and the images that came in the years of the Clone Wars were dark ones. He saw Padme dying. He saw her in pain. He saw the moment of her death with the clarity of prophetic vision, and every piece of Jedi teaching he had received told him that attachment was dangerous, that love led to suffering, that the right response to this vision was to release it to the Force and trust that what came would come. He could not do it. He had tried his whole life in the Order to do the version of being a Jedi that meant keeping what he felt at arm's length, acknowledging it and setting it down, moving through the world with the serenity the Code described. He had never fully managed it. The feelings were too large and too real, and the training had never given him a way to be inside them safely. And now the Force was showing him the death of the person he loved most in the world, and the Jedi answer was to let go. He could not let go. And in that inability, the space was created for something else to enter. Sheev Palpatine had been cultivating a relationship with Anakin Skywalker for years. Patient, careful, consistent attention. The kind of interest and warmth that the Council, for all its institutional wisdom, had never quite offered. While the Jedi told Anakin in various ways that his feelings were problems to be managed, Palpatine listened. While the Order kept him at a certain careful distance, Palpatine was close. He had positioned himself with extraordinary skill and patience as something between a mentor and a father figure in Anakin's life. Someone who seemed to understand him in the specific way that Anakin had always felt the Order did not. It was manipulation, deliberate and calculated and evil. But it was manipulation that worked because it was meeting a real need. The need to be known, the need to be accepted as the person you actually are, not the person the institution needs you to be. Anakin was not wrong to want that. The tragedy is that the person offering it was the darkest threat the galaxy had ever produced. When Palpatine revealed himself as Darth Sidious, as the Sith Lord the Jedi had been searching for, as the shadow behind every catastrophe that had visited the Republic in living memory, Anakin was in possession of this knowledge and facing an impossible choice. He had to report it. He knew he had to. He told Mace Windu, and Windu went to confront the Chancellor with a group of Jedi Masters. What happened in that office is one of the pivotal moments in galactic history, and it is also one of the darkest moments in Jedi history. Not because of what Palpatine did, though what he did was terrible, but because of the choice it forced from Anakin, and what that choice revealed about the failure of everything the Order had tried to build in him. Windu had Palpatine beaten. The Sith Lord, disfigured by his own lightning, was disarmed and defeated and at the mercy of the Jedi Master. And Anakin arrived at the moment when Windu was about to end it, about to kill a disarmed, defeated enemy rather than arrest him. Anakin's argument against that killing was not wrong by the standards of what he had been taught. The Jedi were not executioners. Palpatine should be arrested and faced justice through the Republic's legitimate processes. These were arguments a Jedi was supposed to make. These were the values the Order had spent 13 years trying to give him. But underneath those arguments was the real reason Anakin could not let Windu kill Palpatine. The real reason was that Palpatine had told him the dark side held the key to preventing death. That through Sith knowledge, through secrets the Jedi had never discovered, it was possible to save the people you loved from dying. And Anakin believed, with the desperate belief of someone who has run out of every other option, that if Palpatine died, the knowledge died with him and Padme died too. He intervened. He stopped Windu. And in the moment that Palpatine finished what Windu could no longer do, something broke in Anakin Skywalker that could not be unbroken. The choice had been made. He knew what it cost. He knew, with the terrible clarity that comes after the point of no return, that he had crossed a line from which there was no coming back. Not because the dark side told him so, because he knew himself well enough to understand that a person who intervenes to save a Sith Lord at the cost of a Jedi Master has already, in the most fundamental sense, chosen. He knelt. He took the name Sidious gave him, Darth Vader, and he went to do what his new master required. What he was required to do was go to the Jedi Temple. The temple on Coruscant was not just a building, it was the institutional heart of the Order, the place where thousands of years of tradition and learning were housed, where masters trained Padawans in the same halls where masters had trained Padawans for generation after generation, where the youngest children who had been identified as Force-sensitive were brought to begin their first steps in learning what they were. It was, in every possible sense, the most Jedi place in the galaxy. Anakin went to the temple at the head of a battalion of clone troopers, and he did not spare anyone. What happened in the Jedi Temple on the night Order 66 was executed is one of the most difficult passages in the history of the Order to sit with fully. Not the large-scale, military, across the galaxy aspect of it, though that was catastrophic in its own right, but specifically the temple, because in the temple there were children, young ones who had only begun their training, students who had spent their lives in those halls learning to be Jedi and had done nothing except exactly that. Masters who had committed themselves to the Order with everything they had and were there doing their work when the door opened. Anakin killed them. He killed the masters and the knights and the Padawans and the younglings. He moved through the rooms he had walked through himself, through the spaces where he had trained and struggled and grown, and he did not stop. The Jedi do not use the word slaughter easily, but the word applies here. At the same time that Anakin was at the temple, across the entire galaxy, the clones were executing Order 66. The command had been embedded in them since their creation, a sleeper directive implanted in their conditioning that made killing their Jedi generals not a moral choice, but a mechanical response. When the order came from Palpatine, they turned on the Jedi they were serving beside. Jedi who had fought alongside those same soldiers for years, who knew their names and their histories, who had led them into battle and brought them home when they could and grieved when they could not. The clones did not hesitate. The command fired, and they turned, and the Jedi, who were in the middle of operations, in the field, at the front, surrounded by the soldiers they had trusted with their lives, had almost no time to understand what was happening before it happened. Some survived by luck. Some survived by the Force warning them in time to act. Some survived because they were alone, or because the specific circumstances of their location gave them a chance that most Jedi did not have. But the number who died was enormous. An order that had numbered in the thousands was reduced in a matter of hours to a scattered handful of survivors who did not yet know if anyone else had lived. The ones who survived were now hunted. Palpatine had created the Inquisitorius for exactly this purpose. Former Jedi who had fallen turned to the dark side and repurposed as hunters of their former colleagues. They knew how Jedi thought because they had been Jedi. They knew where Jedi hiding places might be because they had known the same places. And they moved through the galaxy with the Empire behind them, following Force signatures and informants and the thin traces that survivors leave when they are trying not to be found. Each Jedi who survived Order 66 had to make a choice. Stay hidden and watch the galaxy become something unrecognizable. Find a way to resist, alone, against an empire with unlimited resources and Darth Vader himself at the apex of its Force-sensitive hierarchy. Or try to find others and build something from the ruins of what had been. Most could not build anything. The mathematics of the situation were too brutal. There were not enough survivors, and the galaxy was not safe for them. But some did things that mattered in the immediate, local, human sense, even when they could not matter in any broader strategic sense. A Jedi who could not rebuild the Order could still protect a village, could still stand between one person and something that was going to hurt them, could still use what they had been given in service of someone who needed it, even if that service was small and invisible and would never be recorded anywhere. This is worth naming because it is part of what the Jedi were, even in their most broken state. Not the institution, not the council, not the 1,000-year tradition of accumulated wisdom, just people who had been given something and chose to use it for others, even when there was no structure telling them to. No community to validate the choice, no certainty that anyone would ever know. The darkness of the Imperial era is measured in the lives it destroyed, and that number is incomprehensibly large. But the people who survived and continued are also part of that measurement. They are what remained of the light when the light had been reduced as far as it could be reduced, without going out entirely. Most could not build anything. The mathematics of the situation were too brutal. There were not enough survivors, scattered too widely, with too little communication possible without risking discovery. Some lasted years before the Inquisitors found them. Some lasted decades. Some died not in battle but in the slow exhaustion of hiding, of living compressed, of spending year after year in the discipline of being invisible. Obi-Wan Kenobi took himself to Tatooine. He had a specific reason beyond simply hiding. Anakin's son had been born in the same moments that Order 66 was being executed, and Obi-Wan had taken the infant to his only available family and stationed himself nearby. He watched. He waited. He aged in the Twin Sun Desert and thought, during the long years, about everything that had happened and his role in it. The question he must have turned over in the silence of those years was not one with a comfortable answer. He had known Anakin longer and more closely than almost anyone alive. He had watched him grow from the boy on the landing pad on Coruscant into the most formidable Jedi of his generation. He had argued with him, worried about him, been proud of him, been infuriated by him. He had watched the way Anakin carried the Force, the way it moved through him with an intensity that had no real precedent in Obi-Wan's experience. And he had tried to teach toward that intensity rather than against it, while also holding the shape of what the Jedi tradition required. He had believed for a long time that he was succeeding. He had believed that the person he knew, the person underneath the intensity and the frustration and the emotion that the Order's structure was not quite built for, was fundamentally oriented toward the right things, toward protection, toward care, toward the people who needed someone to stand for them. He had not been entirely wrong, but he had missed something, or several somethings, and the missing of them had led to a moment in an office on Coruscant that Obi-Wan had not witnessed, but that he understood entirely from its consequences. There is no clean accounting of blame in a failure this large. The Council made choices that had consequences. The Order made structural decisions that had consequences. Palpatine's manipulation was real and deliberate and sophisticated beyond almost anything in the history of Sith scheming. Anakin's own choices were his own, and Obi-Wan had done his best with what he knew and what he understood and what he was capable of offering. His best had not been enough. And living with that, in the desert, over 20 years, is the specific darkness that belonged to him alone. The question he must have turned over in the silence of those years was not one with a comfortable answer. He had trained Anakin. He had taught him, as well as he knew how to teach. He had believed in him. He had loved him, in the careful Jedi way that was not supposed to be called love, but was. And he had missed something. Something that, if he had caught it differently, might have changed, what Anakin became? Was it the relationship with Padme? The attachment the Order forbade, but could not actually prevent? Was it the moment Anakin was brought to the Council? Too old, too afraid, already shaped by a life the Order had not been part of? Was it something in the specific way Obi-Wan himself had taught? Some limitation in his own approach that a different master might not have had? These questions have no clean answers. Obi-Wan had more time than almost anyone to sit with them, and the desert gave him nothing but the questions back. Yoda went to Dagobah, also alone, also with his own weight of questions that had no comfortable resolution. Yoda, who had been the most senior and most respected member of the Jedi High Council for the better part of 800 years, who had seen the Order at its heights and guided its direction through crises and recoveries and the long, stable centuries between them, sat in a swamp on an uncharted world and waited. His exile was a meditation on failure, not the performative kind, the real kind. The kind where you sit with what happened and resist the temptation to arrange it into a narrative where you did your best and could not have known. The kind where you ask honestly whether there were things you should have seen that you did not see, ways the institution you led had become something less than what it should have been, decisions made with good reasoning that had nevertheless been wrong. The Council had known Palpatine was the enemy before the end, but they had not known in time, and they had been wrong about the shape of the threat throughout the long years of its construction. They had watched the Republic slide toward crisis and identified the wrong causes and the wrong solutions. They had held Anakin at a certain careful distance because of his fear and his attachments. And that distance had created exactly the isolation that Palpatine needed to do his work. They had sent Jedi generals into a war that had been manufactured from the beginning for the purpose of destroying the Jedi. And they had not seen the mechanism clearly enough until it was too late. Yoda had to live with all of that, and he did. He lived with it for 20 years in the silence of Dagobah, learning the things that the Order had not taught because the Order had not known them, learning from the Force itself without the mediation of institutional tradition, learning what it meant to carry failure and still keep faith with something worth keeping faith with. He was 900 years old, and he was starting over. Whatever else can be said about the Jedi, that fact deserves to be held without irony. The oldest and most senior member of the Order that had just been destroyed sat in a swamp on an uncharted world and decided that learning was still worth doing, that the Force still had things to teach, even now, even here, even after all of this. That the capacity to keep learning after catastrophic failure was not a small thing, but possibly the most important thing. The Empire's persecution of surviving Jedi was not something that ended quickly or neatly. For years after Order 66, the Inquisitors were active. They hunted across the galaxy with resources and determination, and they were effective. The number of Jedi who survived the initial purge and then survived the years that followed was very small. But some did survive, and some of them found ways to act, to help people, to continue being what they had been trained to be, even without the structure that training had assumed would always be there. They did it alone, mostly in hiding, without reinforcement or support, or the knowledge of whether anyone else was still out there doing the same. There is a specific kind of darkness in surviving a catastrophe that destroyed almost everything around you. The guilt of being alive when others are not. The isolation of carrying knowledge of a world that no longer exists and that most of the people around you never knew. The uncertainty of whether what you are holding on to is worth holding on to, or whether you are just refusing to accept that it is gone. The surviving Jedi held on anyway. It is one of the things that can be said of them without any qualification at all. Whatever the failures of the order that had produced them, whatever the institutional blindnesses and the philosophical rigidities, and the mistakes of judgment that had contributed to the catastrophe, the individuals who survived and continued to act did so with a commitment that was genuinely their own, genuinely chosen in the absence of any institutional support or expectation, genuinely the expression of what they had come to believe a Jedi should be. Decades passed. The galaxy lived under the Empire. Force sensitivity became dangerous, something to hide, something that drew attention you did not want. An entire generation grew up in a galaxy where the Jedi were, at best, a fading rumor. A story told about protectors who had existed once and were gone now. Some of that generation had been taken as children to be trained as inquisitors. Most of it simply had no context for what the Jedi had been or why it mattered. And in the middle of all of this, on a desert world that seemed to produce universe-altering, force-sensitive individuals with improbable regularity, a young man named Luke Skywalker began to feel the Force for the first time. Luke's story is one of the most improbable redemptions in the history of either the Jedi or the Sith. And it is also, in some specific ways, one of the most painful chapters in Jedi history because of what came after it. But before what came after, there is what happened first. And what happened first is remarkable. Luke was not trained in the Jedi tradition in any conventional sense. He spent a short time with Obi-Wan, aged and burdened by the years in the desert, who gave him enough to begin and then died so that he could continue. He spent time with Yoda on Dagobah, who taught him what he had learned in exile, which was different in important ways from what Yoda had taught in the temple, more honest about limitation and failure, more willing to sit with difficulty rather than prescribe the clean answer. And he did the thing that no Jedi before him had successfully done in the same way. He refused to give up on his father, not out of naivety. He knew what Darth Vader was. He had seen it. He had felt it. He had fought his father and lost his hand and looked into the darkness that Vader wore like a second skin. He knew, and he still believed, that the person who had been Anakin Skywalker was not entirely gone. That the darkness was real, but not the whole of what was in there. The Council, the old Council, might have told him that was attachment, that he was letting his love for a parent cloud his judgment about the reality of the threat. There is a version of the orthodox Jedi position that would have counseled him to accept that his father was lost and focus on stopping Vader as the enemy he had become. Luke did not accept that version. He held on to something that the old order had not always been able to hold on to, the possibility of genuine redemption, of return from the darkest places. Not through optimism or willful blindness, but through love clear-eyed enough to see the worst and not look away. And Anakin came back. In his final moments, injured and dying, he came back. He lifted the Emperor and threw him into the abyss and chose, for the first time in decades, the sun over the darkness. He died as Anakin Skywalker rather than Darth Vader. The man who had walked into the Jedi Temple at the head of clone troops and killed children died having made the hardest choice available to him, and choosing the right thing. This was not nothing. It was, in certain ways, everything. But the cost of it was immense. The cost was measured in all the years of the Empire, all the people who had suffered and died under it, all the Jedi who had been hunted to extinction, all the worlds that had lived in fear. All of that was real, and it had happened, and Anakin's redemption in his final moments did not undo any of it. It only meant that the person responsible for much of it had, at the end, come back to himself. Luke understood this in the way that he seemed to understand most things, through feeling rather than analysis. He burned his father's armor on Endor, not in triumph, but in grief and love. He mourned what had been and what had been lost and what had been saved, and the fact that saving it had come so late and cost so much. And then he tried to do what Yoda and Obi-Wan had never quite managed, at least not in the form it needed to take. He tried to rebuild. The new Jedi Order that Luke founded was not the same as what had existed before the Purge. It could not be. Too much had been lost. Too many of the texts had been destroyed or scattered. Too many of the masters who had carried the traditions in living memory were gone. What Luke built was something new, rooted in the same force and the same fundamental values, but built differently. Because the person building it had come to the Jedi tradition differently than anyone who had built it before. He accepted students. He trained them in a way that reflected what he had learned, which was not the orthodox Jedi way, but something that had grown from the ruins of it. He made mistakes that the old order would not have made in some areas, and he avoided mistakes the old order had made in ways he understood clearly. It was imperfect and alive, the way anything built by one person on the wreckage of something much older has to be imperfect and alive. Among his students was his nephew, his sister Leia's son, a boy named Ben Solo, who was strong in the Force in a way that brought the Skywalker lineage's extraordinary gift forward into a new generation. Luke taught Ben. He invested in him the way a teacher invests in the student whose potential is clearest and whose character, in formation, shows the most promise. And something went wrong. The exact shape of what went wrong with Ben Solo is a story told from multiple perspectives, each of which contains part of the truth and none of which contains all of it. What can be said with certainty is that Ben was being influenced, that something from outside, from the dark side, in a form that had grown in the shadows since the Emperor's death, had been reaching toward Ben Solo the way a current reaches toward the lowest point in a landscape, finding the path of least resistance, finding the crack. Luke felt it. He sensed the darkness in Ben, recognized it the way someone recognizes a familiar face in an unexpected place. And in a moment that he would carry for the rest of his life, he did something. He ignited his lightsaber. He had not decided to do it. Not in the way decisions are usually made. It was a reflexive response to the darkness he felt. A fraction of a second reaction in the force that he arrested almost immediately, that was never completed, that he pulled back from before it became anything more than an impulse. But Ben was awake. Ben saw it. In the light of Luke's ignited blade, in the half-instant before Luke stopped himself, Ben Solo saw his uncle about to kill him. The betrayal that Ben experienced in that moment was real, even though it was not the betrayal that was shown to him. What he saw was someone he loved and trusted moving to strike him down in his sleep. What had actually happened was a man who loved him reaching towards something terrible and stopping himself before he reached it. But Ben did not see the stopping. He saw only the reaching, and the darkness that had been working on him, patiently and specifically, had prepared him to see exactly that and to respond in exactly the way it needed him to respond. he destroyed the temple. He took some of the students with him. He killed others. And the students he killed were the ones who had done nothing except trust the person they had come to learn from. This is one of the things that makes Ben Solo's fall so specifically painful in the context of everything that came before it. The Order had been destroyed once already. Luke had tried to rebuild it from the wreckage. Carefully, aware of what the old order had missed, and trying to do better. And the destruction had come again, from inside, from someone Luke had loved and invested in and believed in a pattern that mirrored Exar Kun's corruption of Jedi students so precisely that it felt, in the worst possible way, like the Force itself was repeating a lesson no one had yet learned how to actually hear. He destroyed the temple. He took some of the students with him. He killed others. And he went to the dark side, calling himself Kylo Ren, and devoted himself to a master he had never met, who had been engineering this moment for years. Luke found himself alone in the ruins of what he had built. The students who had come to him, who had trusted him, who were dead because of a moment he had not fully chosen, a moment he had stopped, but not in time, not for all of them. The nephew he had loved and trained and tried to help had become something that used the same Force Luke had taught him for purposes. Luke had spent his life opposing, and he did what Yoda and Obi-Wan had done before him. He disappeared. He went to the first Jedi temple, on Ahtu, an island world at the edge of ancient things, where the oldest records of the Order were kept in a tree library that predated almost everything Luke had ever been taught, and he was going to let the Jedi end. His reasoning was not simple. He had thought about it, in the long years of his self-imposed exile, with the seriousness that the question deserved. He had looked at the full arc of Jedi history, and he had concluded, in a conclusion that was painful precisely because it came from love rather than bitterness, that the pattern was broken beyond repairing, that the Jedi Order had produced Darth Vader, that Luke himself had produced Kylo Ren, that the cycle of the Force producing Jedi who fell and became Sith who destroyed, and then Jedi who rose from the ruins to fall again, was not going to be interrupted by another attempt to rebuild the same institution. He was wrong. But he was wrong in a way that came from having understood so much. He had looked at the history honestly enough to see the pattern, and honestly enough to believe that his own failure was an argument for stopping. He had not yet found his way to the understanding that stopping was itself a choice, that the Force continuing through the people it touched was not the Order's decision to make. A young woman found him. She had come from a desert of her own, in the middle of a crisis, carrying a lightsaber that had belonged to Anakin Skywalker, and then to Luke, and then been lost for decades. The Force had brought her there the way the Force had always found the people it needed. She was not what Luke had expected, which was probably the point. He tried to send her away. She refused. He taught her anyway, reluctantly, and then genuinely, because the Force in her was undeniable, and because deep underneath the self-imposed exile, there was still the teacher who had always believed that the light was worth passing on. He did not go with her when she left. He stayed on the island and did what he had not done before, what the old Jedi tradition had not fully taught, and what his own life had not quite arrived at until now. He let go, not of people, not of love, but of the specific form of the Jedi Order as he had tried to rebuild it, of the weight of the temple he had let fall, of the grief that had been eating the center of him for years. He let it go in the only way it could be let go, by returning to the Force completely. He died, reaching across the galaxy to give the last remnant of the Resistance time to escape, projecting himself across an impossible distance through the Force, sustaining it long enough for the people who needed it to get away, and then becoming one with the Force on the island, where he had tried to let everything end. It was a death that was also a choice, and the choice was the opposite of giving up. It was the act of someone who had come, finally, and through enormous difficulty, to understand what the Jedi were actually for. Not the institution, not the council, not the traditions and the texts and the carefully maintained structures of training, but the thing underneath all of that, the willingness to stand between the darkness and the people who needed protecting, even when you had to do it alone, even when everything you had tried to build was gone. This is the full arc of the darkest moments in Jedi history, and what that arc traces, from the Force Wars on Tython, through the fall of the Temple and the years of exile and the last light on Ahch-To, is not a story of an order that failed because it was weak or corrupt or did not care. It is the story of an order that failed in the specific ways that any human institution fails when it loses the living center of what it was built to protect. The Jedi, at their best, were not their rules, or their traditions, or their architectural heritage, or their institutional standing within the Republic. The Jedi, at their best, were people who chose, repeatedly and in full knowledge of the cost, to stand between the darkness and those who needed protecting. Masters who trained Padawans not to produce more Jedi, but because they believed the thing they were passing on was genuinely worth having. Individuals who went into darkness not because they were fearless, but because the alternative was to let people suffer who did not have to suffer. Every fall in this story, from the Force Wars to Ben Solo's destruction of the Temple, traces back not to the Force itself, but to the things that grow when an institution starts to prioritize its own continuation over its founding purpose. The rigidity that keeps someone who needs help from finding it, the distance that creates the space for a Sith to occupy, the rules that become, over centuries, more important than the reasons behind them, the fear of attachment that becomes, paradoxically, a different kind of attachment, to a version of purity that the living reality of the people the Order serves can never quite match. And every recovery in this story, from the exile who held the Order together after the triumvirate to Luke, standing alone on Ahch, to buying time with his life, traces back to the same thing: individual commitment. The decision made in the full knowledge of what it costs and what might not work and what has already been lost. The decision made anyway. That is what makes the Jedi worth telling stories about. Not that they were perfect. They were not. Not that they never fell. They fell catastrophically and repeatedly, but that they kept coming back. That something in the tradition, in the connection to the Force and to each other and to the people they served, was worth enough to keep coming back to even after everything. The Order has known darkness that most civilizations never encounter. It has broken and lost itself, and been reduced to one or two people holding a very small light in a very large darkness. And the light kept going, not because the institution was indestructible, but because the people who carried it believed in it enough to carry it alone when there was no one else. That, at the end of this long journey through the worst the Jedi ever experienced, is the thing that stays. Not the darkness, not the falls, not the failures of councils or the betrayals of students or the mistakes of masters who should have known better. Those things are real, and they happened, and they matter. But they are not the final word. The final word is the person who keeps going. The last Jedi on the last island, choosing to use the last of themselves for the people who needed it. The survivor in the ruins of the temple, picking up what could be saved and starting again. The voice that speaks into the silence, even when there is no certainty anyone can hear. Let that stay with you now, in the quiet of wherever you are. Let the darkness of these stories settle into its proper place, which is not at the center, but in the full picture. The Jedi carried every one of these wounds across thousands of years, and they kept going anyway. That is not a small thing. That is, perhaps, the most Jedi thing there is. Rest now. Let the galaxy be still. The stories have been told.